All right. Hey, if you've been with us for the last few weeks, or if you followed us online and you've heard about kind of the sermon series that we've been in over the past month and a half or so, is really this sermon series called All In. And what we've been exploring is this idea that faith is actually an all or nothing proposition, that there is a journey for sure that we are part of. But whether you're not a Christian here or whether you've been a Christian for a while and you've been wondering what does faith really look like, faith is something where Jesus invites us to call him to be Lord of all, or he's not Lord at all. And that's one of the things that we've been exploring and looking at. And one of the texts that we looked at a couple weeks ago was this text from Romans chapter 12, verses 1 to 2. And it's this text that's written, it's actually a letter that's written by the Apostle Paul to the church in Rome and the early church in Rome. And here's what it says in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. And this is what we were exploring a couple weeks ago. It says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy." So in light of everything that God has done, and this is what the letter to this early church in Rome was about, in light of everything that God has done with his great and lavish love and grace and mercy, check out what he says. He says to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. Now, that's just another way of saying is be all in. Will you give your entire life and being, your breath, your words, your time, your energy, everything to God? Will you present it as a living sacrifice to God, holy and pleasing to God? This is your true and proper worship. Now, this is what Paul is saying. Now, check out what he's saying as he talks about this idea of presenting yourselves as a living sacrifice, presenting yourselves as someone who's all in. If you would go all in with God, not kind of this wishy-washy, maybe like exploring for a long 5, 6, 7, 8 years, and you've never really given that full commitment. What Paul is basically saying is, offer your lives as a living sacrifice. Now, check out what he says. Do not conform, and this is what we explored a couple weeks ago. Do not conform to the patterns of this world. In other words, every one of us, whether we're a Christian or we're not, whether we're religious or we're irreligious, every single one of us are formed by different factors, whether it's the media, whether it's the culture, whether it's the American dream. Even if you're not a Christian, it might be the culture around us, the culture of your workplace, the culture of New York that tells us that success is defined by how much money you make and how successful you are in your career. And not that these are bad things, but many of us are conformed to simply the tidal wave of the things around us, whether it's the media, whether it's the American dream, all these other things. But here's what Paul says. Paul says, don't do this. Don't be conformed by the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. In other words, the call to follow Jesus, the call to be all in with him, to be a living sacrifice, it means that you're not conformed to everything else that your coworkers and your friends and family that might be following all sorts of cultural elements and values as it relates to sex, money, success, and all those other things. Instead, this is what Paul is saying. Paul is saying, instead of being conformed to those things, will you be transformed by the renewing of your mind? That your mindset changes, that what you believe changes, that the patterns of thinking change for you. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Now, what's fascinating is that Paul wrote this roughly 2,000 years ago or so. And modern science, especially in the last 30 years, if we could put the photo up of the brain, here's the literal physical brain when we talk about the mind. Now, modern science, there's been all sorts of new kind of revelations related to the brain and the activity of the brain. And recently, I've actually been reading a book about kind of the science of the brain and neurons. And what I'm about to say will demonstrate that this is way above my pay grade. But instead, I'm just basically going to share with you some of the things that I've learned about the brain and about the mind from Wikipedia. And so there's actually something called neural pathways. And neural pathways, again, over the last 30 years, this has become popularized by different neuroscientists who have studied neural pathways. And neural pathways are basically this, that the brain is made up of a bunch of neurons. And check out what it says. There's a connection formed by axons that project from neurons to make synapses onto neurons in another location to enable a signal to be sent from one region of the nervous system to another. Neurons are connected by a single axon or by a bundle of axons known as a nerve tract or fasciculus. Now, this is basically just a technical way of saying this, that the way that we live and move and our mind begins to shape things in our behavior, there's actually neural pathways that have been conditioned along a certain pathway by which we do certain behaviors. So in other words, these neural pathways are the ways that I react to the environment that I'm in. when things happen, when I start feeling anxious or afraid, it triggers a neural pathway by which I'll start thinking a certain way, and it'll affect the way that I behave. And so these neural pathways then are these preconditioned ways that I begin to think and behave related to a certain circumstance. And every single one of us has them. Now, different kind of neuroscientists have said that most of these neural pathways that we possess, they begin to get codified, and then by the age of 25, most of us, what ends up happening is these neural pathways are basically pathways that have been conditioned to think a certain way, to believe a certain thing, and to behave a certain way. And so as a result, what we often get shaped by are these neural pathways. And so you and I, we have these neural pathways as it relates to how we react to certain situations, how we behave, how we've been conditioned to function within our workplace. These neural pathways get encoded for most of us to the age of 25. Now, what these neuroscientists have actually learned, though, is there's something called neuroplasticity. Can I hear you say neuroplasticity? That's right, neuroplasticity. Now, here's what neuroplasticity is. The brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections or new neural pathways throughout life. Neuroplasticity allows the neurons or the nerve cells in the brain to compensate for injury and disease and to adjust their activities in response to new situations or to changes in their environment. In other words, there's a way in which my mind, I can begin to start forming new habits so that new neural pathways, this is what neuroplasticity is, so that new neural pathways can begin to form. So instead of just following kind of default of whatever conform to the patterns of this world might be, I can actually begin to build habits that would change the pathways, and this is what neuroplasticity is. I change the pathway of my brain so that I'm now building new habits and starting to form new ways of behaving and thinking and all of that sort of stuff. Now, here's the thing. But most of us, if it's been encoded up to the age of 25 or so, for many of us, it actually takes hard work for neuroplasticity to take place. Most neuroscientists say that it takes roughly 66 days to form a new habit. Now, it can be as low as 18 days to as many as 200 plus days to change new habits or to form new habits. But nonetheless, it actually requires a consistent, over time, repetitive, new way of thinking and behaving. Now, this takes effort. It takes time. It takes energy. Now, isn't that interesting that here Paul is, and here he's writing to the early church in Rome, and this is what he's saying. He's saying, all of us have been conformed to something, and many of us, it's the patterns of this world. But for us to truly transform, for us to truly change, it means that we need to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. Now, he didn't say it in these terms, but he's basically saying, we need to be transformed by neuroplasticity. We need to change the way that we think and believe and behave. And the reality is we've been talking about this whole all-in type of idea. For many of us, it's just simply something that we listen to and something that tickles our... Maybe religion is just something that we do week after week, and it's just part of our rote memory and part of our rote kind of understanding of what the religious life is like. But we've never actually offered to God a complete transformation and a renovation of our minds. We haven't offered to God, please come and transform the way that I think about relationships and forgiveness. God, come and please transform my mind, like neuroplasticity over the habits over many, so that I would change the way that I speak to my family or my coworkers. God, please come and change my mind over a long extended period of time so that I might be more like you as it relates to how I handle my money. Instead, what we've done is we just get conformed, and our neural pathways, we have not offered those to God and said, God, come and take my entire mind. But yet, here's what Paul is saying. Paul is saying, no. Don't you see? We're all being formed by something. The question is, have you offered to God your whole self, your whole mind, your whole body, every single part of you to say, God, come and take all of me. Come and transform the way that I think about myself. Transform the way that I think about the world. Transform the way that I approach my relationships, my work, all of these other things. Now, whether it's the culture around us, whether it's our family of origin, we've all been encoded for these neural pathways to lean towards something. Many of you know that part of our discipleship pathway here is we offer these two courses. One course is called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, and the other course is called Emotionally Healthy Relationships, as well as Alpha. And then we have something called the Hub. But Emotionally Healthy Spirituality and Emotionally Healthy Relationships, we actually do a lot of work on reflecting on our family of origin, so the families that we've come from. And what does it mean for us to break free from the patterns of our family? And I'm going to flash up here kind of a photo of, we have something called a genogram, and a genogram is actually kind of it's an outline of our family histories. And the family histories show different trends from generation to generation that some of us have experienced. And this is my genogram, and it's intentionally blurry so that you can't see it specifically. Just kidding, but you can see most of it. And I've actually done this exercise. We do it in our groups as we explore what are some of the new neural pathways when it comes to ways that we want to, as followers of Jesus now, not followers of the Hyun family, but followers of Jesus. What does it look like for us to live into a new destiny? For neuroplasticity to take place, for me to change the way that I think and behave related to certain topics or beliefs. And so I've actually been reading this book on trauma, and the book that was recommended to me related to trauma because I was meeting with my mentors, Pete and Jerry Scazzaro, and we were going over my genogram. We were looking at my family history. And you may not be able to see it specifically, but so my family, Tina and I, are on the bottom right of this diagram, and then David and Avery are at the bottom. Those are our two kids who are 7 and 3 years old. And then above that generation is basically my parents, and then my parents, the family that they came from. And so I was going over my genogram with Pete and Jerry, and I was showing this to them. And I was telling them about my grandparents. Now, my grandparents, they lived during the era of Japanese occupation and the Korean War. And so in my grandparents' generation then, my dad's father, my dad actually never knew his father because his dad died in the Korean War at the age of when my dad was 3 years old. And 3 of my dad's siblings also died in the Korean War. So my dad grew up, like he grew up in wartime. One of his earliest remembrances that he recounted to me was that he remembers as like a 3-year-old being carried on the back of his mom, my grandmother, and she was like a peasant farmer, and so he said he remembers being on her back, and they're walking away from a building, and then they hear this loud explosion behind them, and it's the house that they had just left, and it had just been bombed. So I want you to get this sense of, like, my dad, like, grew up with just severe trauma, like war trauma. And so, like, it shaped him, and he didn't have a father. And then my mom's side, my maternal grandfather, he was someone that, I mentioned this a few weeks ago related to racism. He had some really awfully difficult experiences with the Japanese, and so he turned to alcohol, and so he drank a lot and ended up dying early because he had liver problems because of how excessively he drank, and it caused all sorts of turmoil within his family. And actually, my mom's generation, you see, my uncle also died from alcohol abuse that affected his liver. And you see a bunch of, like, marriages that didn't make it. And so you don't even have to see it specifically, but there's a bunch of squiggly lines, and there's a bunch of, like, X's. And all of those squiggly lines and X's actually relate to trauma. And so, of course, my parents, can you imagine this? My parents then, they're the products of war, and they immigrate to the United States in their early 20s. So they're the products of war with torn up families. People have died, earthquake events. And now they're moving They're moving to the United States of America where they don't know anyone and they don't speak English very well. So now they're immigrants here and they're trying to raise a family. Now, can you imagine this? Like, of course, like what chance did they have for their marriages to be flourishing and doing well? And right when they get here, they start having babies, one of which is me. And so in 3.5 years, they have 4 boys. Now, some of you are like, how is that possible? Well, I have a twin brother. So, all right, so some of you are like, you're lying now. I can't believe it. No. So I have a twin brother. And so like there's 4 boys then that are all in diapers. So I was told. There's 4 of us running around. I'm like the pressures of making it financially. Like dealing with the trauma of their parents having been through war. The trauma of being an immigrant. Of course, like you can see in their relationship and in our relationship, there's all sorts of violence and abuse and all this. And like, don't you see, like, we had no chance. So as I was sharing this with Pete and Jerry, and they were looking at this, and they know my story, but they were like, Drew, we think you should see a trauma therapist. And they gave me a book, and this book was about trauma, and it was related to neural pathways, what trauma does to the brain and what it does towards the ways that we behave. Now, some of you know that a couple weeks ago, we had this really frightening moment where my wife, Tina, on Friday morning, a couple weeks ago, she just texted me and said, I need you to come home right away. So I came home, and our little 3-year-old was there in our apartment, and my wife is just moaning and like agonizing. Like I've never seen her in such pain before. And like this is way more than pregnancy and birth and all that stuff. Like she's crying and she's moaning, and she said, I just called 911. I don't know what's happening to me. So the paramedics are on their way. And I'm here, and my 3-year-old has no idea what's happening. And so I scoop her up, and I'm getting all the stuff ready, and the paramedics arrive, and they're going, and Tina is just in agony. And meanwhile, I'm like, hey guys, can you work a little faster? You know, I'm like, guys, can you, like, is it normally this slow? I mean, come on, is it normally, like, I'm just kind of, all this nervous energy in me. And we get to the ER, and she's just in pain. And I have no idea what's going on. And Avery and I, we ride the ambulance together. We finally get there. She just tells me, Tina tells me, she says these words. She's like, it feels like I'm dying. You know, I've got my daughter in my hands, you know, in my arms. And I'm like, so we get to the ER. She's in such agonizing pain. And like after a few hours of tests and lots of meds, like, thank God for modern medicine. They give us a diagnosis, and she has to have a couple of emergency surgeries. And so we find that out like late Friday night and then into Saturday. And okay, so she's going to be okay, right? Like she's going to be okay. Oh, praise God. Wow, amazing. Many of you don't even know this, but I came Sunday. So there's Friday. This all happens on Friday. Saturday, she's in the hospital. And Sunday, I show up here. None of you knew this. I just preached like nothing's wrong. We just made it. Oh my goodness, God's amazing. He's going to whatever. I don't even remember what I preached on, but I just preached my heart out. In fact, at the beginning of the gathering, we have a huddle with our volunteers. And guys, some of you have heard that Tina's in the hospital. I just want you to know, things are okay. Things are okay. Please don't ask me. I'm okay. We're good. We're good, everyone. And of course, I'm not good. I'm like torn up inside. But because of my family history, what I've learned about grief and loss is that you just pound through it. You just move ahead. You just preach like it's 1999. You just go for it and you just move on. That's what you do. That's what it means to follow Jesus. And then a week or two later, like it's leaking all over the place though, right? Because I'm trying to act like I've got it all together, like I'm strong and I don't need anyone's help. And yet I'm at home and my son is doing this little model thing and I'm getting frustrated at him. I'm like, David, you should know how to do this. David, come on. You don't even need the directions. You can do it. And there's like an edge to my tone, and people around me are like, Drew, are you okay? You seem really kind of wound up. I'm like, yeah, I'm okay. They're like, okay. Well, you sound like, no, I don't. I don't sound that way. I'm like, oh, you kind of do. And I'm leaking all over the place. It's because I've learned, my neural pathways tell me that this is what I do when I go through something hard. And here I am just wrestling through. How do I? How can I be a Jesus follower? How can I submit my whole past and the trauma that lives within me? How can I offer it to you, God, so you can do something new? Wendy Seidman, she actually studied Bloom's taxonomy when she talks about how people really change. And one of the things that she would adapt is she talks about, like, how do we really change? Like, how do we move from thinking and behaving a certain way to actually changing, to having this neuroplasticity that changes us? And she actually comes up with this kind of pattern, and she says the first thing is awareness. We just become aware of something. And for many of us, when it comes to church world and when it comes to the religious experience, this is probably where we are. We're just aware. We're like, yeah, that's cool. And we're probably only aware of 25% of it. If you were here a couple weeks ago when you heard about kind of how many of us, we just listen for 25%. And like, you're just aware. And then there's pondering. Okay, I begin to get aware of it. Yeah, I've been aware that, yeah. And then I begin to ponder. Am I really all in with my money? Am I really all in with my relationship? Am I really all in with my career? Am I really all in? Right? You're pondering it. And then, of course, you go from awareness to ponder it to saying, I value this. And perhaps many of us are here today. I value this. I value following Jesus. I value Jesus as if he's the Lord of my life. And yet, there exists this wide chasm between what we say we value and what we actually do. And so there's this enormous action behavioral gap. There's this gap that exists within all of us because our neural pathways are simply just leading us down the same roads. And here's what's happened. You've probably come week after week listening to me for 25% of the time. And you're probably thinking, oh yeah, I'm aware of this. I've pondered this. I value this. But the reality is, how many of us have actually changed? How many of us have actually taken this leap to action and behavior in the ways in which we treat our spouse or treat our children or treat one another or treat our coworkers? How many of us have actually changed as it relates to how we handle our money and how we approach success? Or what we do with our time instead of just running to our addictions. And so here's what we end up doing. And I'm so guilty of this, and I need God's help. This is what we do. We're aware of something. We ponder it. We say we value it, but yet what we still do is whenever I feel anxious Instead of turning to prayer and to God, instead what I'll do is I'll turn to Netflix. Because this is what my neural pathways have done. That whenever I'm starting to feel fear or anxiety, I just pull out my phone and I'll start toggling through all sorts of things and I'll make all sorts of purchases because that just somehow makes me feel better about myself. And if you want to purchase something, feel free to buy the perch outside, merchandise outside that supports our youth ministry. If any of you are feeling fear or anxiety, you can do that. Some of us, what we do, or when we feel fear or anxiety, we just turn to whatever addiction there is, whether it's pornography, whether it's gossip. And the reality is we can talk all day. I can talk all day about how much Jesus means to me, but the reality is I'm still in this aware, ponder, and value. And there's this chasm. There's this action behavioral gap. And the question is, will you cross that gap? Will you actually make some changes? Will I actually make changes about the way that I deal with grief and loss so that it's not passed on to my kids and to those around me? What will it take? Because we can talk about this all day long. We're so used to playing this religious game. I know I am. And when we go from there, it's finally to prioritizing it, to actually owning it. How many of us, and this is what this All In series has been all about, because we can talk all day. We can keep attending church services and listen to 25% of what I'm saying. At the end of the day, what's going to get you, what's going to get me to actually make some changes? Now, here's the thing. Like, you're probably listening to me, you're like, wow, Drew, like, this is a really, like, you're really going after this thing, this action behavioral gap. Feels really hard. Well, I actually want to say this because this issue of going across this chasm is actually not something new. In fact, the earliest church would wrestle with this. The Apostle Paul, again, who's one of the founders of Christianity, in the same letter in which he would write to tell people, be not conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. In the same letter, look at what Paul writes about his own journey in life. Check this out. He basically says this: we know that the law is spiritual, but I am unspiritual, sold as a slave to sin. Here Paul is. I love how honest he is. Here's what he says: I do not understand what I do. Sorry, that was my paraphrase there. I do not understand what I do. Anyone ever been there before? Anyone ever said that to your spouse? I don't understand what you... No, I'm just kidding. Don't raise your hand. All right, here we go. For what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, I do. And if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is good. As it is no longer I myself who do it, but it is sin living in me. For I know that good itself does not dwell in me. That is in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good. I'm aware of it. I ponder it. I value it. I have this desire to make the right choices, to say the right things, to be someone who's kind and forgiving and gentle and loving. But I can't carry it out. I keep running to my addictions. I keep running to my pain. I keep doing the bitter thing. I keep doing the unforgiving thing. I keep being a mean person. And he says, for I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do. This I keep on doing. I mean, in some ways, isn't this the most miraculous, beautiful, personal missive coming from one of the founders of Christianity, talking about this struggle? Look what he says. This I keep on doing. Now, if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it is sin living in me and does it. So I find this law at work. Although I want to do good, evil is right there with me. For in my inner being, I delight in God's law, but I see another law at work in me, waging war. It's like there's this war going on inside of me. How many of us have ever felt that, especially in this journey of life, especially in the relationships that mean so much to us, especially when it comes to our hopes, our dreams, our wishes? And he says, waging war, could we go to the next slide? Against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within me. What a wretched man I am. Who will rescue me from this body that is subject to death? Gosh, I mean, isn't this the human experience? I just keep doing what I don't want to do. Sorry, that was my translation there. And I don't do the things that I want to do. You know what's so beautiful about this? Is number one is Paul, he's being so real and authentic here. But number two, like one would think that the religious explanation for how do we address this? What's the antidote for this? And the antidote is you work harder, you do better, you become more religious. But notice what Paul says. He says, no. He says, what will rescue me? Can go back to the previous. Who will rescue me from this body that is subject to it? Thanks be to God who delivers me through Jesus Christ our Lord. And look at what he says at the beginning of chapter 8. He says, therefore, there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Because through Christ Jesus, the law of the Spirit who gives life has set you free from the law of sin and death. Oh, don't you love this? Here Paul is just berating himself, wondering, why do I keep making these mistakes? Why do I keep living a certain way? Why do I keep living with an unforgiving heart? Why do I keep living, like constantly going back to my addiction? And one would think that the answer is, Paul, you better do better. You better shape up. But no, what he says is, thanks be to God for Jesus. And now there is no condemnation for those who are found in Jesus. In other words, the answer that Paul gives to himself is grace. Grace and more grace and more grace. Thanks be to God. There's a Savior in heaven who has loved me enough that even in my weakness, I can come to him and I am forgiven and free from condemnation. And today can be a new day. Today can be the day in which I live under his grace. Today can be the day in which I can begin a new neural pathway. And here's the thing, today can be the day for you and for me, for each of us, to begin to live a new destiny. That condemnation and guilt are way too overrated. But instead, today can be the day that you can be free. That you can begin to live in his grace. That you can begin to live empowered by the one who loves you and died for you and knows you and is more committed to you than even you are to yourself. Yeah, Dallas Willard, who was a late philosopher, one of the things that he wrote about grace, which I keep coming back to, is this. He says, grace is not opposed to effort. It is opposed to earning. Earning is an attitude, but effort is an action. Grace, does not just have to do with forgiveness of sins alone. In other words, God actually grants us the grace to put in some effort. Because this is what it takes, right? It takes a renewing of the mind. It takes a neuroplasticity. It takes new habits to form, new ways of thinking. Instead of thinking of yourself in a certain way and berating yourself and finding yourself down a rabbit hole that continues to haunt you, it takes hard work to get out of that, to begin thinking a new way. It takes effort. And here's what we do. Today, what we do is we can ask God, God, will you give me the grace? Will you give me the grace to put in the effort? Will you give me the grace to live a new destiny? Will you give me the grace to be freed from the old way, to live into the new that you have for me?